Okay, we are on to 7.2. We are still talking about natural selection. And you might be asking yourself who this gentleman over here is. This is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Again, this guy is often the classical example, or the classic example, of a scientist that got it wrong. I, however, don't want you to think that's a bad thing. It's a good thing in science to get something wrong. And he at least was developing ideas that later evolved, no pun intended, into the correct theory on things, or closer to the correct theory on things. He believed in this kind of a complexifying force, which if you saw my previous video, you'll notice that this looks somewhat like a stairway, right? Things are becoming more complex until they're reaching some sort of model organism here at the top, right? We like to think it's us up here at the top. But he also believed there's this adaptive force in which these species kind of adapted out sideways within their genus. And this complexifying force was kind of like it's like the X and Y axis, if you will, of how species evolve. Obviously, this turned out to be wrong, but again, I don't want to go too hard on him. But this is what he's known for, and it kind of isn't as cut and dry as this, because this is merely one piece of some of the things that he discovered, but the use and disuse theory. The idea being that something like a giraffe, right? A giraffe, I'm sorry, this looks like a brontosaurus, but a giraffe needs to eat something up high. So he stretches his neck, and maybe he reaches leaves. And as these leaves get higher and he stretches his neck more, something changes within him or her, and he passes this down to offspring. Right? This is the theory of acquired characteristics or acquired traits passed down from generation to generation, right? In much the same way, if you had a parent that worked out a lot, you would think that, the prevailing thought during this time, or, if you believed Lamarck, were that, hey, your children and offspring would have larger muscles or a higher propensity to work out. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that, at least not as far as we know, although I'm going to write a word down here. Epigenetics. This is something that kind of vindicates somewhat Lamarck, because it is kind of interesting that there are things that exist outside of our genetic code which can be passed on to offspring. But I don't want to talk about that yet. We will talk about that later. Okay, this guy you've probably heard of for sure before. This is Charles Darwin. You've read an article about him already. Set off in the HMS Beagle. Traveled to the Galapagos Islands and made many observations about natural selection. Actually, kind of codified this theory into writing. Made it more appealing to the masses. That's what he's famous for. Really interesting man, very important man, important enough to be on British currency, etc. Maligned in some circles in the United States because of, well, I'm sure you know why. He was at the time. These were very controversial ideas amongst the general public and even amongst scientists at the time. But what he thought was traits are not acquired. In other words, he saw these finches here, right? He sees that they have different beak length sizes, different beak lengths, different beak depths. Some of these are very fat beaks, some are long and narrow beaks. And he did not believe that these traits were acquired from necessarily previous generations, i.e. there wasn't some force that caused this bird here with this specific beak, because it needed it, it changed to adapt to that. That's not how it works. He argued that there was an underlying genetic variation and phenotypic variation. Underlying genetic variation. Right? So what he says is that there is an ancestral species. There's an ancestral species that probably landed on one of these islands. Right? landed on a finch species number 1, we'll call it, landed on this island. And as they, adapted to this island, they probably changed somewhat over time. But this is due to the fact that you have, again, underlying genetic variation due to mutation in this species. Now, as you have different islands out here, right, different islands, these birds might travel to a different island. Now, species 1 populates this island. Now, this food source might be a bit different. Maybe these seeds are harder to crack and they need tougher beaks, something like that. Over time, the individuals that do not have this ability, this ability to break down these seeds, will die off. And the ones that do will live on through the process of natural selection, and they will reproduce. And eventually, through time, again, remember the sieve that I talked about a few videos ago. Everything passes through it. Over time, a new species was born, for lack of a better word over here. This diverged into a new species, right? If these birds were to go back, they would not breed as successfully with this initial species. Now, this happened many times, right? Oh, maybe species 2 shut off here and made species 4. So this can happen many times, right? The point is, you end up with what's called this phylogeny of species, right? And this is probably not a correct phylogeny. I'm just kind of drawing this to illustrate what Darwin is trying to say here. And that's that you have these traits that are passed on. You have variation in a species. And you can look around and see that even in humans. We have a lot of variation between us. A lot of things we have different. These would help us adapt to different environments, not because, not for any noble or driving force within us that causes us to change externally, but because we are varied. Those of us who are not adapted will die off. Those of us who are adapted will tend to reproduce, have greater reproductive success, and live on. Before we really talk about anything else, we do need to define a word here. Fitness. No, this is not what you do when you go to the gym, although I guess it is, but not in our sense. Fitness is the ability of an individual to pass on its genes. Greater fitness means greater reproductive success. Greater fitness equals greater reproductive success. This is true amongst any species, right? But I think I'll go over the classical example here. Let me erase all this ink here. The classic example is the peppered moth. The peppered moth. Of course, this was 1800s, in which you guys may have heard this one already before, but this is in the 1800s in England, the Industrial Revolution, right? Imagine buildings covered in soot, black, grimy soot, this kind of byproduct of all this industrial action that was happening, all of this smoke being generated, covering these trees. You had kind of an ancestral moth here, which did not have this kind of dark exterior that this moth up here has, right? Well, there is, although it is a light-colored moth, you can see even in here there is some darker parts, and there's this variation that exists in the population. Some moths happen to be very black, happen to be very dark. They fit in very well against dark surfaces. Well, as soot covered these trees, they noticed that the decline of this moth, this white moth over here, and an increase in the numbers of this black moth. You might ask yourself why. Well, birds, right? Birds come in here to eat these moths. It's their diet, right? And they're going to eat the ones that they can see a lot more often than they're going to eat the ones they can't. So, after these trees become covered in this dark soot, these white moths become much more visible, and the birds have an easier time digesting them, eating these birds. Now, the dark colored variations, which might have been kind of rare, right? Probably pretty rare. Well, they happen to be the only ones that would survive. So they would reproduce and pass on their genes. They had a greater fitness. A greater fitness. So they survived and passed on their genes. This is, let me erase some of this stuff here so you can see this graph. This is what's called directional selection. So light colored moths, you have this variation. You do have some dark colored moths. There's a directional selection effect pushing there's selective forces through natural selection that are pushing this moth population into a darker phenotype, these darker colored moths. So this is an example of directional selection. And this graph illustrates it really well. I'm going to talk about different types of selection here on this next slide. Okay, so directional selection. When a species is kind of moving one direction, a good example of this would be that giraffe neck length, right? Longer necks tend to pass on their genes to the next generation, and over time you end up with longer necks. Stabilizing selection. This stabilizes this curve. Instead of it moving one direction, it actually just pushes in. A good example of this is birth weight in humans, right? Babies want to be big enough to be healthy and survive, so it's pushing their birth weight up in this direction. But neither mother nor child survives if it's too large, so that is kind of pushing birth weight this way in a form of stabilizing selection. And lastly, there's disruptive selection. A good example of this being there's a species of mice in which there is very dark rock. I think they're called rock pocket mice. There's dark rock and light rock. And these create two different environments, and it's caused these species to kind of diverge and become either very dark or very light, but not in between. The in-between phenotype does not survive as well. This creates disruptive selection, meaning that these species are kind of moving in different directions as far as phenotypes go. Now, eventually, don't be surprised if this disruptive selection creates species 1 and species 2. But that'll be a discussion for another time when we talk more about speciation and what a species is. So this is your first video on the topic of natural selection specifically. We'll move on to topic 7.3 next. Thanks for listening.